The courtroom smelled like old wood and expensive cologne, the kind that clung to men who measured their worth in zeros. Naomi Washington sat with her hands folded over the swell of her belly. 7 months now, the baby pressing against her ribs like a promise she wasn't sure the world deserved to keep. Across the mahogany table, Daniel Ashford signed papers with the same careless flourish he'd once used to write love notes on coffee shop napkins, back when his handwriting meant something other than erasure. His attorney, a sharp-faced man named Preston who charged more per hour than most people earned in a week, leaned close enough for his whisper to carry. The courtroom acoustics were built for drama, and Margaret Ashford, Daniel's mother, seated in the gallery like a queen surveying conquered territory, smiled at whatever cruelty her son's lawyer had just delivered. Naomi didn't need to hear the words. She'd spent 4 years learning to read the language of dismissal, the particular tilt of a head that said you were being erased in real time. Judge Margaret Harrison, no relation to the Ashfords, though the coincidence of names had made Daniel's mother laugh during their first hearing, looked over her reading glasses with the expression of someone who'd seen this script too many times. The judge was in her 60s, silver hair pulled back so tight it might have hurt, and she had the kind of face that suggested she didn't suffer fools but had learned to tolerate them for 40-hour weeks. Mr. Ashford, I trust you understand the gravity of the documents you're signing. Daniel straightened in his chair, the navy suit Naomi had helped him pick out last year, back when she still believed in things like shared futures catching the winter light from the tall windows. Yes, Your Honor. I think we can all agree this is long overdue. The words landed like coins in a collection plate, small and metallic and final. Naomi's lawyer, Grace Patterson, was a woman in her early 60s who'd taken the case pro bono after 3 other attorneys had suggested Naomi be realistic about her options. Grace had warned her this morning over burnt coffee in the courthouse cafeteria. Daniel had the better legal team, more resources, and 4 years of carefully positioned assets that made their marriage look like charity work instead of partnership. Mrs. Washington. The judge's voice pulled Naomi back to the present, to the reality of her belly pressing against the table edge, to the fact that in 2 months she'd be a single mother with a Honda that needed constant repairs, and a house mortgaged to the foundation. Do you have anything you'd like to say before we proceed? Naomi opened her mouth, tasted copper and caution, and closed it again. What could she say? That her husband had spent 6 months sleeping with Victoria Lane, his colleague, while Naomi's body stretched and ached to make room for their daughter? That Margaret Ashford had spent 4 years teaching her son to be ashamed of the woman he'd married, one surgical comment at a time? That somewhere in a storage unit across town, Naomi had boxes of her father's belongings she'd never opened because grief was expensive, and she'd been too busy pretending her marriage wasn't dying? No, Your Honor. Daniel's smile widened just enough for Naomi to remember why she'd fallen for him in the first place. He'd been kind once, genuinely kind, the type of man who left notes tucked into jacket pockets and remembered how she took her coffee. But kindness, Naomi had learned, was like summer. It didn't survive the first frost if it wasn't rooted deep. Grace shuffled papers with hands that trembled just slightly, the tremor of someone who knew they were about to lose but showed up anyway because some battles were worth fighting, even when the outcome was written in stone. Your Honor, before we conclude, there is one matter that requires attention. Mrs. Washington's late father, Marcus Washington, passed away 2 years ago. Due to administrative delays at the probate court, his will was never properly executed. The temperature in the room shifted. Daniel's smile faltered, not much, just a crack in the veneer. Preston straightened, his pen pausing mid-notation. Margaret leaned forward in the gallery, her expression sharpening into something hungry. What inheritance? Daniel's voice carried across the courtroom, too loud, too defensive. Her father was a janitor. He worked nights cleaning office buildings. The way he said janitor, like the word itself was something dirty that needed to be swept away, made Naomi's jaw clench. Marcus Washington had worked multiple jobs to raise her after her mother died, had shown up to every school play and parent-teacher conference smelling like industrial cleaner and exhaustion, had built something out of nothing while men like Daniel inherited their starting positions, and called it self-made success. Grace's voice stayed steady, though her hands still shook. That's precisely what we need to clarify, Your Honor. Mr. Washington's estate was never properly processed. There are legal documents that were overlooked during the initial probate period. Judge Harrison leaned forward, interest replacing the bored tolerance she'd worn since 9 that morning. What kind of documents, Ms. Patterson? His last will and testament, Your Honor, along with several property deeds, corporate partnership agreements, and trust documents that materially affect the division of assets in this divorce. Daniel laughed, actually laughed, the sound echoing off the high ceiling like birds startled from a roost. This is absurd. We're not delaying our divorce because of some paperwork mix-up from 2 years ago. What could he possibly have left her? His work boots? Victoria Lane, seated 3 rows back and wearing red like a declaration of war, giggled. The sound was small and sharp and meant to be heard. Daniel turned to wink at her, a gesture so casual it might have been reflex, except Naomi saw the calculation in it. The performance of a man who wanted his soon-to-be ex-wife to understand exactly how replaceable she'd always been. Grace pulled a thick folder from her briefcase, the kind of documentation that suggested weeks of preparation, and handed it to the bailiff. Your Honor, I have copies of the delayed probate filing, correspondence with the court regarding the administrative errors, and preliminary asset documentation from Mr. Washington's estate executor. The judge took the folder and the courtroom fell into the particular silence of people waiting for a bomb to either detonate or prove itself a dud. Pages turned. Margaret's breathing grew audible, sharp little inhales that spoke of impatience barely leashed. Preston scribbled notes, probably calculating how much extra he could bill for unexpected complications. Naomi kept her hands on her belly, felt her daughter kick, a tiny foot or elbow, impossible to tell which, just the insistent reminder that someone else's future depended on what happened in the next few minutes. She'd read her father's letter last night, the one he'd left in a sealed envelope marked, "Open when everything is taken." The pages had smelled like his cologne, Old Spice and something indefinable, and the words had been written in his careful handwriting. If you're reading this, the 5 years ended. I watched who you chose, now I'll watch who he chooses when things get hard. Judge Harrison finally looked up, her expression unreadable in the way of people who'd learned to keep their cards close even when the hand was about to end. This is highly irregular. Ms. Patterson, these documents appear to reference substantial assets that would indeed affect the marital estate division. Substantial? Preston stood so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. Your Honor, with all respect, this is clearly a stalling tactic. Mr. Washington passed away 2 years ago. If there were any significant assets, they would have been processed through probate at the time. Not necessarily. The judge's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen enough cases to know that paperwork and justice moved on different timelines. Administrative errors in probate aren't uncommon, particularly for estates that weren't represented by counsel. If Mr. Washington's will was filed incorrectly or misfiled entirely, it could have sat in limbo for years. Daniel's face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan, the kind you got from winter vacations in places Naomi had never visited despite being married to a man who went twice a year. Your Honor, we can't postpone the entire divorce because someone lost paperwork. Mr. Ashford, Judge Harrison's voice could have frosted glass. I suggest you lower your voice in my courtroom, and I suggest you consider that there might be more to your wife's family than you assumed. The gavel came down, sharp and final as a door slamming. This court will recess for 1 week to allow proper examination of Marcus Washington's estate and will. We'll reconvene next Tuesday at 9 a.m. to determine how these newly discovered assets affect the divorce proceedings. Preston tried to object, words tumbling out about precedent and procedure, but the judge was already standing, black robes swirling as she exited through the door behind the bench. The bailiff called the traditional "all rise," though half the room was already on their feet, motion and noise filling the space where silence had been. Naomi stood slowly, her body heavy with pregnancy and something else. Not hope, not yet, but maybe the absence of despair, which after 4 years felt almost the same. Grace touched her elbow, gentle the way you'd steady someone on ice. Don't react, don't let them see anything. But Daniel was already crossing the space between them, his shoes clicking on the marble floor, and for just a second Naomi saw the man she'd married, the one who'd proposed in the coffee shop where they'd met, who'd gotten down on one knee between tables of strangers and said her name like it was the only word that mattered. Then his mouth opened and the illusion shattered. Naomi, we need to talk. This is insane. Whatever your lawyer thinks she found, we both know your dad didn't have anything. He was a good man, I'm not saying he wasn't, but let's be realistic here. Realistic, the word tasted like ashes. Daniel had been realistic when he'd suggested she quit her marketing job to support his career. Realistic when he'd convinced her they didn't need separate bank accounts because married couples should trust each other. Realistic when he'd started coming home late and stopped looking her in the eye. I don't think we have anything to discuss until next Tuesday, Daniel. His hand reached for her arm, stopped just short of touching, and Naomi watched him remember, probably too late, that they had an audience. Margaret was watching from the gallery, her expression unreadable but her posture perfect, spine straight as judgment. Victoria had disappeared, likely calculating whether this complication was worth her investment in a man whose divorce had just gotten messy. Preston appeared at Daniel's shoulder, murmuring something about optics and client management, and Daniel's hand dropped. Fine. But you're making this harder than it needs to be. For both of us. Grace guided Naomi toward the exit, her grip firmer now, protective. The hallway outside the courtroom was all marble and echoes, the kind of architecture designed to make people feel small. Naomi's reflection caught in the polished floor. A woman 7 months pregnant in a simple black dress that had cost $30 at Target. Hair pulled back in a bun because she couldn't afford the salon anymore. Couldn't justify spending money on herself when the baby needed so many things. Don't go home yet. Grace's voice was low, urgent. There's someone you need to meet, someone your father arranged for you to contact when the time was right. The taxi ride to Harrison and Associates took 20 minutes through downtown Boston traffic. Winter sun glinting off snow piled along the curbs like dirty promises. Grace paid the fare. Naomi had started carefully rationing what little money she had access to, the joint account Daniel monitored like a hawk, and led her into a building that made the courthouse look humble. Glass and steel and the kind of quiet money made when it didn't need to announce itself. Robert Harrison's office was on the 14th floor with windows that framed the city like a painting. He was waiting when they arrived, a man in his early 70s with silver hair and eyes that reminded Naomi achingly of her father, not in color or shape, but in the way they saw through pretense to the person underneath. Miss Washington, he stood, extended a hand. I've been expecting your call for 2 years now. Your father said you'd know when the time was right. Naomi took his hand, felt calluses she didn't expect on a lawyer's palm, and wondered what kind of man her father had trusted with whatever this was. I don't understand. My father never mentioned you. He didn't talk to me about his work, his life, just my life, my school, my future. That was intentional. Robert gestured to chairs arranged near the windows, leather and expensive and somehow still comfortable. Marcus was very specific about how this should unfold. Please sit. This is going to take some time to explain. Grace settled beside Naomi, close enough to be support, far enough to give space. Robert opened a folder on his desk, not the preliminary documents from court, but something thicker, older, edges worn from handling. Your father and I met 22 years ago when you were 6. He came to me with $200 in savings and an idea that most people would have called impossible. He wanted to invest, wanted to build something that would ensure his daughter never had to struggle the way he had. $200. Naomi remembered that money, remembered her father counting it out on their kitchen table in the apartment they'd shared after her mother died, remembered thinking it was a fortune. She'd been wrong about the fortune part, but not about the importance. Her father had treated those bills like they were made of something more precious than paper. Over the next 20 years, Marcus turned that $200 into $12 billion. The number sat in the air between them. Impossible. A word in a language Naomi didn't speak. 12 billion. She'd heard it, processed the syllables, and still couldn't make it mean anything. Her father had worn the same jacket for 8 years, had packed sandwiches for work because buying lunch was wasteful, had lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Dorchester until the day he died. That's not possible. That's not. Robert's smile was gentle, the kind reserved for people hearing truths that didn't fit their understanding of the world. Your father was one of the most brilliant investors I've ever met. He worked nights as a janitor, yes, but that job gave him something more valuable than income. It gave him access. He pulled out a photograph, slid it across the desk. Marcus Washington in his maintenance uniform, standing in front of a building Naomi recognized. The same office complex where Daniel's firm was located, though this picture was old, 20 years at least. Her father younger, but with the same quiet strength in his posture. Marcus cleaned offices for some of the biggest companies in Boston, CEOs, boardrooms, private meetings. People talked freely around him because they didn't see a janitor as a threat. He heard merger discussions, expansion plans, financial troubles. He learned which companies were about to explode and which were about to implode, and he invested accordingly. It made terrible, perfect sense. Her father had always known things, had made comments about news stories that proved prescient months later, had advised Naomi on her student loans with the precision of someone who understood compound interest down to the decimal. She'd thought he was just smart, just careful. She'd never imagined he was building an empire while emptying trash cans. Why didn't he tell me? The question came out smaller than she'd intended, childlike, and Robert's expression softened further. He did tell you in a way. He left you a letter, several actually, and specific instructions about when you should receive this information. Another envelope, this one thicker, sealed with her name in her father's handwriting. Naomi's hands shook as she opened it, careful not to tear the paper, though what she really wanted was to rip it open and devour whatever words her father had left behind. The letter was dated 6 years ago, before she'd even met Daniel, before any of this had started. My dearest Naomi, if you're reading this, then 2 things are true. I'm gone, and you found yourself in a situation where you need help. I'm sorry I'm not there to give it in person, but I want you to understand something important. I didn't keep this money secret because I didn't trust you. I kept it secret because I wanted you to know what you were made of before the world tried to tell you different. I'm giving you 5 years to live as a normal person. 5 years to find someone who loves you for who you are, not what you have. If you meet someone, fall in love, build a life, and that person sees your worth without knowing about this money, then everything I built is yours to keep. Use it well. But if in those 5 years you discover that the person you chose can't see your value when things get hard, when money gets tight, when your belly swells with his child and you're vulnerable, then you'll know he never loved you at all. He loved the idea of you, or what he thought you could be, or maybe just the convenience of someone who asked for nothing because she didn't know she could ask for everything. I'm watching, sweetheart. I'm documenting. And when you're ready, when you've seen enough, All you have to do is call Robert Harrison. He'll show you what patience builds. He'll show you what you're truly worth. Remember what I always told you. Patience is the most expensive thing to own. Wealthy is cheap. Anyone can stumble into money. But to wait, to watch, to build in silence while the world tries to convince you you're small, that's power most people can't afford. You were never small, Naomi. You were always everything. I just needed you to know it for yourself first. Love always, Dad. The words blurred as tears came, hot and sudden and 4 years overdue. Naomi had cried the night her father died, cried at his funeral, cried alone in the bathroom of the apartment she shared with Daniel while her husband slept peacefully in the next room. But this was different. This was grief mixed with rage, mixed with something that felt dangerously close to vindication. 5 years. Her father had died 2 years ago, which meant he'd written this letter a year before she'd even met Daniel. He'd set up a test she hadn't known she was taking, a deadline she hadn't been counting toward, and somehow, impossibly, the timing had worked out exactly as he'd planned. She'd met Daniel 5 years ago, 5 years of watching, waiting, documenting, 5 years of her father seeing everything she'd tried to hide. The slow erosion of her husband's kindness, the surgical cruelty of Margaret's comments. The affair she'd pretended not to notice because acknowledging it meant admitting she'd chosen wrong. He knew. The words scraped out. He knew Daniel would do this. Robert's expression held something complicated. Pity and pride braided together. He didn't know specifically, but he understood human nature. He'd seen what money did to people, how it changed them or revealed what was always there. The test wasn't about whether Daniel would fail, it was about whether you'd recognize failure when you saw it, and whether you'd be strong enough to walk away. Grace reached over, squeezed Naomi's hand. Your father left very specific instructions. The will was intentionally delayed. Robert filed it with the probate court, but included documentation that would trigger administrative review, essentially putting it in bureaucratic limbo until you activated it by seeking legal help for your divorce. He planned for this, for all of this, not the specifics. Robert stood, walked to the windows, looked out at Boston spread below them like a game board. But he prepared for the possibility. Men like Daniel, men who measure worth in status and connections, they follow patterns. Marcus studied those patterns for 20 years. He knew what signs to watch for. He turned back, and his expression had shifted to something more businesslike. The gentle grandfather replaced by the attorney who'd built a career managing billions. Your father's estate is extensive. I'll need several hours to walk you through the complete asset breakdown, but the summary is this: 12 commercial properties in Boston and Cambridge, partnership stakes in 6 different companies including a 78% controlling interest in Ashford Consulting Group, and liquid assets totaling just over $2 billion in various investment accounts. The room tilted. Naomi gripped the armrest of her chair, felt her daughter kick again, harder this time, insistent as if the baby could sense the shift in gravity. Daniel's company. Her father owned Daniel's company. Every promotion, every bonus, every success her husband had celebrated as evidence of his own brilliance. It had all been orchestrated by the man he'd never bothered to meet, the janitor he'd dismissed with a laugh in open court. Daniel doesn't know! It wasn't a question, but Robert answered anyway. No one knows except the 3 of us and the handful of shell companies and trusts your father used to structure his investments. Marcus was very careful about maintaining his anonymity. He enjoyed the irony of it, I think, cleaning the offices of people who never suspected he owned the buildings they worked in. Grace pulled out more papers, these ones marked with sticky tabs and highlighter. There's something else. Your father didn't just invest passively. Over the last 2 years, after he saw how Daniel was treating you, Marcus started documenting. He hired investigators, kept detailed records, tax irregularities, offshore accounts, evidence of Daniel's affair with Victoria Lane. She spread the documents across Robert's desk like a card dealer revealing a winning hand. Bank statements showing transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Photographs of Daniel and Victoria at a hotel in Newport, his hand on her lower back, her head tipped toward his shoulder. Email printouts with messages that made Naomi's stomach turn. Discussions of when to announce the pregnancy publicly, how to manage optics, whether Naomi would make a scene or go quietly. One email stood out, dated 3 months ago, from Daniel to Victoria. She has no idea what she's entitled to in the divorce. My lawyer says we can settle for maybe 20% of reported assets, and I've been careful about what gets reported. Naomi will take whatever I offer because she doesn't have money for a real attorney. This will be done by Christmas and we can move forward with our plans. Christmas. It was December now, snow piling up outside while her husband calculated how to minimize what he owed her for 8 years of marriage, for carrying his child, for being the woman he'd promised to love and honor and apparently quietly discard when someone shinier came along. He thought I was stupid. No, Robert's voice was firm. He thought you were powerless. There's a difference. Stupid is lack of intelligence. What Daniel assumed was lack of resources, lack of options, lack of anyone in your corner who could fight back. He was wrong on all counts. Grace started organizing the documents back into folders, her movements precise. Judge Harrison, the one overseeing your divorce, she's Robert's wife. Complete coincidence. We didn't arrange that. But when Robert heard her mention your name in conversation last week, he knew the 5-year timeline was up. He knew your father's plan was about to activate. 2 Judge Harrisons, married to each other, one managing her father's estate and one presiding over her divorce. The coincidence felt less like chance and more like the universe finally paying attention to the right details. What happens next? Robert returned to his desk, pulled out a checkbook that looked like it belonged in a museum, heavy paper with embossed lettering. Next, you take this. He wrote quickly, tore off the check, handed it across. $50,000 made out to Naomi Washington. Immediate expenses, legal fees, medical bills, whatever you need. Consider it an advance on your inheritance. The check felt like it might burn through her fingers. $50,000 was more than she'd earned in 2 years of waitressing, more than the down payment on the house Daniel claimed was his, more than her father had probably made in a decade of night shifts. And it was just a fraction, just the smallest piece of what Marcus Washington had built while the world looked right through him. There's one more thing. Robert pulled out a final envelope, this one marked with a single word, Christmas. Your father wrote this 2 weeks before he died. He instructed me to give it to you when everything else had been revealed, when you understood the full scope of what he'd built. He said you'd know what to do with the information. Naomi took the envelope but didn't open it. Not yet. Some things needed to be absorbed slowly, needed space to breathe. She'd read it tonight, alone in whatever hotel room she could afford with the $50,000 burning a hole in her purse. Read it while her daughter kicked and turned inside her and Daniel slept peacefully next to Victoria in the bed Naomi had been exiled from. The court hearing is in 7 days. Grace stood, gathering her things. I suggest we spend that time preparing your counter-proposal for the divorce settlement. And by preparing, I mean we're going to make Daniel Ashford understand exactly what he threw away when he underestimated Marcus Washington's daughter. They left the office together, rode the elevator down in silence thick with unspoken plans. Outside, winter had deepened, the temperature dropping as afternoon faded toward evening. Naomi pulled her coat tighter, a thrift store find from 4 years ago, back when she'd still been proud of saving money before she'd understood that her thrift was Daniel's calculation. Grace hailed a taxi, gave the driver an address Naomi didn't recognize. We're going to get you a hotel room for tonight, somewhere comfortable where you can think. Don't go back to the house yet. Let Daniel wonder where you are, what you're planning. Let him sit with uncertainty for once. The hotel was downtown, nice but not ostentatious, the kind of place business travelers used for conferences. The room had a view of the harbor, frozen over in patches, light from the city reflecting off ice and water in patterns that looked almost intentional. Naomi sat by the window, hand on her belly, and opened the final letter. Naomi, if you're reading this, you've met with Robert. You know about the money. You know I was watching. I hope you're not angry with me for the deception. Though if you are, I understand. No one likes to discover their life was a test they didn't know they were taking. But here's the truth. I didn't test you to see if you'd pass or fail. I tested Daniel. I tested Margaret. I tested every person who looked at my daughter and saw something less than the brilliant, capable, worthy woman I raised. You passed years ago, sweetheart. You passed every time you kept your dignity when Margaret made you feel small. You passed every time you stayed kind when Daniel grew cold. You passed when you kept building your own skills, your own knowledge, even after he convinced you to quit your job. You were never the one being measured. You were the standard everyone else failed to meet. Now you know what you're worth. In dollars, yes. But more importantly, in patience, in character, in the kind of strength that waits for the right moment instead of reacting to every hurt. I'm giving you a choice now. You can take this money and disappear, start fresh somewhere Daniel and his mother will never find you. That would be justice enough. Or you can do what I think you should do. You can show them who you really are, show them what they dismissed, show them what patience builds when it's paired with purpose. Not for revenge. Revenge is cheap, easy, and it makes you small in the end. But for consequence. So that Daniel understands the cost of choosing status over substance. So that Margaret learns what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. So that your daughter, and yes, I knew you were having a daughter, Robert's been keeping me updated, grows up knowing her mother was the kind of woman who waited for justice instead of settling for anger. Whatever you choose, I'm proud of you. I was proud the day you were born, and I'll be proud wherever I am now. You were my greatest investment, Naomi. Not because of what you might inherit, but because of who you already are. One last thing. There's a man named Ellis Brooks who drives delivery for Summit Express. You haven't met him yet, but you will. When everything falls apart, and it will soon, he'll be the one who helps you. Not because he knows about the money, but because he's the kind of person who sees people instead of circumstances. Pay attention to people like that. They're rarer than you think and more valuable than anything in my estate. The test is over, sweetheart. You passed. Now go show them what passing looks like. All my love, Dad. Naomi read the letter 3 times, watching the sun set over Boston Harbor, feeling her daughter move in the dark rhythm of kicks and turns that meant she was running out of room, getting ready to enter a world that didn't know yet what was coming. Ellis Brooks, Summit Express. Her father had even known about the person who would help her, had seen that moment coming the way he'd apparently seen everything else. The phone on the nightstand rang, the hotel room phone, which meant someone had tracked her here. Grace's voice came through calm and certain. Don't panic. Robert and I thought you might want some company tonight. There's a restaurant downstairs if you're hungry, or room service if you'd rather be alone. Whatever you need. What Naomi needed was to not be alone. Not tonight. Not with her father's words still echoing and her daughter pressing against her ribs like she was trying to break through, ready or not. She met Grace in the lobby, let herself be guided to a corner table where the light was seen and the menu didn't list prices, always a sign of money assuming its own existence. They ordered food Naomi didn't taste, talked about things that didn't matter, and slowly, carefully began to plan what would happen when court reconvened in 7 days. When Daniel discovered that the woman he'd dismissed, the wife he'd calculated his way out of, the mother of his child he'd underestimated so thoroughly he'd put it in writing. When he discovered she owned everything he thought he'd built. He's going to try to bargain. Grace cut her steak with precision that suggested she'd done this before, had sat across from women whose husbands thought they'd won until the moment they lost. When he understands what's at stake, he'll offer you anything to make this go away quietly. I don't want his offers. Good, because the only thing you should want is for him to feel this. Every time he signs a rent check for an apartment he used to own, every time he applies for a job and has to explain why his company collapsed, every time he looks at your daughter and remembers what he chose instead of her. Outside the restaurant windows, Boston moved through its evening routine. People heading home from work, couples walking close against the cold, a delivery truck pulling up to the hotel's service entrance. The driver got out, young black man in his 40s, Summit Express logo on his jacket, and for just a second Naomi thought Ellis Brooks. But no, her father's letter said she hadn't met him yet, said that meeting would come when everything fell apart. Soon then. Whatever was coming, it would be soon. Grace paid the check, walked Naomi back to the elevator, squeezed her hand one more time. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start building the case. By the time we walk back into that courtroom, Daniel Ashford is going to wish he'd been kinder to the janitor's daughter. Alone in the hotel room, Naomi opened the final document Robert had given her. A complete asset breakdown of Marcus Washington's estate. Page after page of properties, investments, partnerships, numbers that stopped making sense after the first few zeros. But one entry made her laugh out loud, a sound that startled her with its sharpness. 450 Morrison Street, Boston, 14-story office building, current tenant, Ashford Consulting Group, lease signed 2019, annual rent $2.3 million. Daniel had been paying rent to her father for 5 years. Paying rent on office space in a building Marcus Washington owned, celebrating deals and promotions and success in rooms her father technically controlled, never knowing that the janitor who'd cleaned those offices once was now the landlord collecting checks every month. The irony was so perfect it felt planned, though Naomi knew it was just her father's particular genius. The ability to be exactly where he needed to be, to own exactly what would matter most, all while staying invisible to the people who thought visibility was the only kind of power that counted. She stood by the window, looked out at the city her father had conquered quietly, hand on the curve of her belly where her daughter was finally settling into sleep. In 7 days, she'd walk back into that courtroom. In 7 days, Judge Margaret Harrison would read her father's will aloud, and Daniel would understand for the first time that the woman he'd married, the wife he'd dismissed, the mother of his child he'd calculated his way out of loving, that woman had never been powerless at all. She'd just been patient, and patience, as her father had taught her, was the most expensive thing a person could own. The hotel bed was too soft, the kind of mattress that cost more per night than Naomi used to spend on groceries in a week. She'd lain awake until 3 in the morning, her daughter restless inside her, both of them adjusting to the weight of what had been revealed. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams of her father in his maintenance uniform, emptying trash cans in boardrooms where men in expensive suits discussed millions, while the janitor who owned their building listened and said nothing. Morning arrived with December light filtering through curtains she hadn't closed, the harbor visible below, ice-locked and patient. Naomi showered in a bathroom larger than her first apartment, dried herself with towels that felt criminal in their softness, and dressed in the same black maternity dress she'd worn to court because it was the only decent thing she owned. The contrast wasn't lost on her. $50,000 in her purse and one presentable outfit to her name. Grace arrived at 8 with coffee and a leather portfolio that looked like it meant business. They sat at the small table by the window, spread out documents that would reshape Daniel's understanding of reality, and began the careful work of building a case that wouldn't just win, but would teach. The key is not to reveal everything at once. Grace had switched from sympathetic lawyer to strategic general overnight, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd done this dance before. We let them think they understand the scope, then expand it. Each new piece of information should feel like the ground dropping out from under their feet again. The strategy made sense in a way that felt borrowed from her father's playbook. Patience as weapon, silence as leverage. The slow reveal that did more damage than any sudden explosion ever could. They worked through lunch, ordering room service that Naomi barely touched, her appetite gone or transformed into something else, some hunger that food couldn't satisfy. By 3 in the afternoon, they had a plan. By 4, Grace had made 6 phone calls that set pieces moving. Naomi couldn't see but could sense, the way you feel weather changing before the first drop of rain. By 5, when Grace finally left, Naomi was alone with instructions not to contact Daniel, not to go home, not to do anything except rest and read the documents they'd prepared. She tried, got through half a folder before her daughter started kicking, insistent and uncomfortable, the way she'd been doing more often lately. 7 months meant 2 months left, meant soon there would be a whole person who depended on Naomi to have done this right, to have chosen correctly, to have protected them both from the consequences of loving someone who'd confused worth with status. The phone rang. Her cell this time, Daniel's name on the screen. She let it go to voicemail, listened to his message with the volume low. Naomi, this is crazy. Whatever your lawyer told you, whatever she thinks she found, we both know the truth. Your dad was a good man, but he didn't have secret millions lying around. Just call me. Let's talk about this like adults instead of dragging it through court for another week. Adults. As if she'd been the child in their marriage, the one who needed guidance and management. As if he hadn't spent 6 months sleeping with Victoria while Naomi's body changed to accommodate his daughter. As if adult was something he got to define and she got to aspire to. She deleted the message, blocked his number, felt the satisfaction of that small power, and immediately felt guilty for the satisfaction. Her father's letter had warned against revenge, had counseled consequence instead, but the line between them felt thinner than she'd expected. Teaching Daniel what he'd lost required making him feel the loss, and feeling it meant suffering. And wasn't that just revenge wearing a more dignified name? The question followed her through the evening, through another meal she didn't taste, through the careful process of getting ready for bed, when bed meant nothing except another night of not sleeping well. Her daughter had settled into a pattern of activity that peaked around midnight. Tiny kicks and rolls that made Naomi's belly shift in ways that were beautiful and alien and occasionally painful. She read more of her father's journal, the pages he'd kept during the 5 years he'd been watching her marriage. His handwriting tracked the deterioration with clinical precision. Dates when Daniel stopped holding her hand in public. Specific comments from Margaret that had landed like surgical strikes. The gradual withdrawal of affection disguised as busyness and stress and the demands of building a career. Month 14. Danielle introduced Naomi as my wife at the charity gala. By month 28, it was just her first name, no context. By month 41, he was attending events alone and explaining her absence with, "She's not really comfortable in these settings." The erasure is systematic. He's not falling out of love, he's being taught to be ashamed. Her father had seen it all, had documented the slow poison Margaret administered, and he'd done nothing except prepare. The restraint must have cost him. Naomi imagined him watching his daughter being diminished, knowing he could stop it with a phone call, a revealed bank statement, a simple, "I own everything your husband thinks he's building." But he'd waited because the lesson required her to see it for herself, to understand not just that Daniel had failed, but why that failure mattered. The next 3 days passed in a strange suspension. Naomi stayed in the hotel, venturing out only for doctor's appointments and walks along the harbor when the cold wasn't too brutal. Grace visited daily with updates that felt simultaneously dramatic and bureaucratic. Depositions scheduled, asset valuations completed, federal investigators expressing interest in Daniel's offshore accounts. On the fourth day, Margaret called. Naomi almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out over wisdom. "Naomi, dear," the endearment landed like a threat. "I think we need to talk, woman to woman, before this situation gets any more unpleasant." Woman to woman. As if they'd ever existed on the same plane, as if Margaret hadn't spent 4 years making it clear that Naomi was temporary, acceptable only until Daniel could do better. "I'm listening. I know your lawyer has made some claims about your father's estate. I'm sure she's very enthusiastic, but these things rarely turn out to be as significant as they initially appear. Court-appointed attorneys sometimes oversell expectations to justify their fees." Grace wasn't court-appointed and didn't charge fees, but correcting Margaret would mean engaging, and engagement was what the older woman wanted. Naomi stayed silent, let the pause stretch until it became uncomfortable. Margaret's voice tightened. "What I'm suggesting is that we settle this privately. Daniel is willing to be generous, more generous than the law requires. We could have papers drawn up by Friday, finalize everything before Christmas. You'd have security, the baby would have support, and we could all move forward without the ugliness of a prolonged court battle." "How generous?" The question seemed to surprise Margaret. Her pause lasted 3 heartbeats. "The house, of course. The mortgage would be your responsibility, but it's a lovely property. And Daniel is prepared to offer $3,000 monthly in support, substantially more than a court would likely mandate given that you have no employment history to speak of." 3,000. Daniel spent more than that on a weekend in Newport with Victoria. The house was mortgaged at $280,000 against a value of maybe $350,000, meaning Naomi would get $70,000 in equity and the privilege of paying down Daniel's debt for the next 20 years. "Tell Daniel I'll see him in court on Tuesday." She ended the call before Margaret could respond, before the temptation to say more could override the discipline of saying exactly enough. Her hands shook, not with fear but with the effort of restraint, of not screaming into the phone that she owned the house already. Owned Daniel's company. Owned effectively everything his mother was offering her as if it were charity. Grace called 10 minutes later. Margaret Ashford just contacted Daniel's attorney demanding an emergency meeting. Preston sounded panicked on the phone. "They're starting to understand this might be real." "Good." The word came out harder than intended, sharp-edged, and Grace's responding silence felt evaluative. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of caution that hadn't been there before. "Naomi, I need you to think carefully about what you want from Tuesday. Not what's fair, not what Daniel deserves, but what you actually want. Because once we walk into that courtroom and reveal the full scope of your father's estate, there's no walking it back. Daniel will lose his company, his home, his social standing. Margaret will become a pariah in circles where status is currency. Victoria will disappear because women like her don't stay when the money runs out. And you need to be certain that's what you want. Not for revenge, for your daughter, for yourself, for the future you're trying to build." The question was fair, deserved consideration, and Naomi gave it the silence it required. What did she want? She wanted her daughter to grow up knowing her mother hadn't been weak, hadn't accepted dismissal as deserved. She wanted Daniel to understand that kindness mistaken for weakness was still strength, just waiting for the right moment. She wanted Margaret to feel the particular pain of realizing too late that the woman she'd underestimated had been holding all the cards from the beginning. But underneath those wants was something simpler and harder to articulate. She wanted to stop feeling small, wanted to walk through the world as herself instead of as an apology, as a woman who took up exactly the space she needed instead of shrinking to accommodate other people's comfort. "I want them to see me, not who they decided I was, but who I've always been." Grace's exhale sounded like approval. "Then that's what we'll give them. See you Tuesday morning, 9 sharp. Wear something that makes you feel powerful." The problem was that powerful wasn't a feeling Naomi had clothing for. Her maternity wardrobe consisted of 3 dresses from Target, 2 pairs of leggings, and a collection of Daniel's old t-shirts she wore around the apartment when she was too pregnant to care about looking presentable. Grace must have anticipated this because a delivery arrived that evening. Not from Daniel's preferred boutique, but from somewhere Naomi didn't recognize. 3 garment bags with a note in Grace's handwriting. "Choose one. My treat. You'll pay me back by winning." The dresses were beautiful in ways Naomi had forgotten clothing could be. Well made, properly fitted for pregnancy, expensive without screaming about expense. She chose the deep blue one, the color of water before a storm, and hung it where she could see it while she worked through the last of her father's journal. The final entry was dated 3 days before his death. Naomi turned 26 today. She didn't celebrate. Daniel forgot again, and she's too proud to remind him. I watched her buy herself a cupcake at the grocery store, eat it alone in the car before going home. The small sadnesses matter more than the big ones sometimes. Those are the moments that show who someone really is. I'm tired today. The doctor says my heart is giving out, that I should slow down. But slowing down feels like giving up, and I'm not ready for that. Not while Naomi still needs protecting, even if she doesn't know she needs it yet. Robert called. The trust structures are finalized. The investigation files are complete. The will is drafted with all the delays built in exactly as I specified. If I die tomorrow, everything is ready. Naomi will be protected. Daniel will be tested. And if he fails, when he fails, because men like him always do, my daughter will have the resources to walk away with her head high. I worry sometimes that I'm playing God, that I don't have the right to set up someone's life like pieces on a chessboard. But then I remember, I'm not playing God. I'm just being a father. Fathers protect. Fathers prepare. Fathers make sure their daughters understand their own worth, even when the world tries to teach them different. If you're reading this, sweetheart, it means I'm gone and you've learned what you're made of. I'm proud of you. I was always proud of you. And I'm sorry I had to die before you could know everything I built for you. But maybe that's how it had to be. Maybe you needed to think you were alone so you could discover you'd never been alone at all. Take care of my granddaughter. Teach her what I taught you. Patience is expensive. Silence is powerful, and real strength doesn't announce itself. Teach her that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest gift, because it means people will never see you coming. I love you. Your mother loves you. And wherever we are, we're watching you win. Dad. Naomi closed the journal, pressed her palm against the leather cover until her hand hurt. 3 days after writing these words, her father had died in his sleep, his heart giving out like an engine that had run faithfully for 62 years before finally admitting it was done. She'd found him in his apartment, still in his maintenance uniform, his work boots by the door, everything neat and ordered because Marcus Washington had never left a mess for someone else to clean up. The funeral had been small. Daniel hadn't come. Some client emergency that couldn't be rescheduled. Margaret had sent flowers with a card that read, "Our condolences on your loss," as if Naomi's father had been a distant relative, instead of the man who'd raised her single-handedly for 16 years. The mourners had been mostly people from his work, janitors and maintenance staff who'd known Marcus as a quiet man who kept to himself but always helped when asked. No one at that funeral had known they were burying a billionaire. No one had understood that the simple casket and modest service were choices, not necessities. Naomi herself hadn't known, had paid for everything on a credit card she'd have to spend the next year paying off, or would have if Daniel hadn't convinced her to cancel the card and rely on their joint account for everything. The memory carried new weight now, new fury. She'd buried her father in debt while Daniel spent thousands on dinners with Victoria. She'd grieved alone while the man who'd promised to love her in sickness and health had been too busy building a career her father had literally funded. The injustice of it burned in ways that made the baby kick, as if her daughter could feel the anger radiating through Naomi's bloodstream. Sunday arrived quiet and cold, the kind of December day that felt like the world holding its breath. Naomi spent it reading through the complete asset breakdown Robert had provided, trying to make sense of numbers that seemed to belong to someone else's life. 12 commercial properties, 6 company partnerships, $2 billion in liquid assets, and underneath all of it, the careful documentation of how Marcus Washington had built an empire while wearing a uniform that made him invisible. One property stood out, 450 Morrison Street, the building that housed Daniel's office. Robert had included the lease agreement, and Naomi read it with the particular attention of someone finding proof of cosmic justice. Daniel's signature on page 12, agreeing to annual rent of $2.3 million, sublease prohibited. Modifications requiring owner approval. Every year for 5 years he'd signed these papers, never questioning who the actual owner was, never investigating the shell company name that hid her father's trust. The irony was almost too perfect. Daniel had built his career in a building his father-in-law owned, closed deals in conference rooms Marcus had cleaned, celebrated promotions in spaces that belonged to the family he'd dismissed as beneath his concern. And now Naomi owned it all, not through marriage or inheritance or luck, but because her father had been patient enough to wait for the right moment and smart enough to document everything that mattered. Monday morning, Grace called with final instructions. Tomorrow's going to be theater as much as law. Robert will present the estate documentation, but the real moment is when Daniel understands the scope. I need you to stay calm no matter what happens. Don't gloat, don't cry, don't show anything except quiet certainty. What if I can't? Then remember what your father wrote. Real strength doesn't announce itself. You've been strong for 4 years while Daniel and Margaret tried to convince you otherwise. Tomorrow you just let them see what you've always been. That night Naomi barely slept, her daughter active and restless, both of them sensing that something was about to shift. She gave up trying around 5, showered in darkness, and spent an hour getting ready with the kind of care she usually reserved for job interviews or important meetings. The blue dress fit perfectly, somehow making her pregnancy look intentional instead of burdensome. She did her makeup, not much, just enough to look like she'd made an effort, and pulled her hair back in a style that suggested competence rather than decoration. Grace picked her up at 7:30, drove through Boston streets still dark with winter morning, and they arrived at the courthouse 40 minutes before the hearing was scheduled. Robert was already there, waiting in the lobby with a briefcase that looked like it had survived decades of legal battles and an expression that suggested he knew exactly how this day would unfold. Ready? His question was simple, but the answer was complicated. Naomi's hand went to her belly, felt her daughter shift and settle. Ask me in 3 hours. They took the stairs instead of the elevator, climbed to the 3rd floor where Superior Court convened, and found seats on a bench outside the courtroom while Robert went to file some last-minute documentation. The hallway filled slowly. Lawyers in expensive suits, clerks carrying folders, a handful of people who looked like they were there for other cases on the docket. Daniel arrived at 8:40, Preston beside him, both men carrying themselves with the confidence of people who expected routine proceedings. Daniel wore the navy suit again, the one Naomi had picked out, and the sight of it made something twist in her chest. He'd been a good man once, or she'd thought he was, and the distance between those two possibilities felt wider than anything that could be crossed by conversation or apology. Margaret appeared 5 minutes later, dressed in the kind of outfit that cost more than most people's rent, her hair perfect and her expression serene. She saw Naomi on the bench and her mouth tightened just slightly, a crack in the facade so small you'd miss it if you weren't looking. But Naomi was looking, had been looking for 4 years, learning to read the micro-expressions that preceded cutting remarks or calculated exclusions. Victoria didn't come. Smart woman, knowing when to maintain distance. Or maybe Daniel had told her to stay away, sensing that today might not go according to plan and wanting to keep his replacement wife separate from the mess of dissolving his current marriage. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors at 8:55 and they filed in. Daniel and Preston to the left, Naomi and Grace to the right, Robert taking a seat in the front row of the gallery. Margaret sat directly behind her son, close enough to whisper advice or commentary. The courtroom smelled like furniture polish and old grievances. Judge Harrison entered at exactly 9 and everyone stood and the machinery of justice began grinding forward. She called the case, confirmed that both parties were present, and looked at the documentation Grace had filed the previous week with an expression that gave nothing away. Before we proceed, I understand there's new information regarding Mrs. Washington's inheritance that materially affects the asset division in this divorce. Ms. Patterson, would you like to present? Grace stood and the courtroom shifted into that particular attention that comes when everyone senses something important is about to happen. Your Honor, we have documentation regarding the estate of Marcus Washington, Mrs. Washington's late father. Due to administrative delays in probate, his will was never properly executed until last week. The estate includes substantial assets that change the financial landscape of this divorce considerably. Preston was on his feet before Grace finished. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mr. Washington passed away 2 years ago. If there were significant assets, they would have been processed through normal channels at the time of death. Not if the will was intentionally structured to delay probate pending certain conditions being met. Robert stood and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd been practicing law longer than Preston had been alive. Your Honor, I'm Robert Harrison, executor of Marcus Washington's estate. May I approach? Judge Harrison nodded and Robert walked forward with his briefcase, extracted a folder that looked official enough to be intimidating, and handed copies to the judge, to Grace, and to Preston. Daniel leaned over to read his attorney's copy and Naomi watched the color drain from her husband's face as he scanned the first page. This document outlines the complete asset breakdown of Marcus Washington's estate, which totals approximately $12 billion in real property, corporate holdings, and liquid investments. Due to specific instructions in Mr. Washington's will, the estate was not to be transferred to his daughter until certain conditions were met, specifically that she had completed a 5-year period of financial independence and had demonstrated the wisdom to recognize when someone valued her for herself rather than her potential inheritance. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing, fingers frozen over keys. Preston found his voice first. 12 billion? That's... Your Honor, this has to be a mistake. Marcus Washington was a janitor. He worked nights cleaning office buildings. He was indeed employed as a janitor. Robert's voice carried no defensiveness, just statement of fact. He was also one of the most successful private investors in New England. Mr. Washington spent 40 years building a portfolio that included commercial real estate, technology partnerships, and strategic investments in companies throughout the Boston area. He preferred to maintain his anonymity, which is why his wealth was structured through various trusts and shell companies. Daniel stood, ignoring Preston's attempt to pull him back down. This is insane, Naomi, tell them. Your father lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Dorchester. He drove a 15-year-old Toyota. He packed sandwiches for lunch because he said buying food was wasteful. All of which was true. Naomi spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite the way her heart was hammering. My father believed in living below his means. He believed that real wealth wasn't about what you spent but what you built, and he believed in testing whether the people around him loved him for who he was or what he had. Testing? Margaret's voice cut through from the gallery. What kind of father tests his own daughter? He wasn't testing me. Naomi turned to look at Margaret directly, held her gaze until the older woman's eyes shifted away. He was testing you, testing Daniel, testing everyone who assumed that because my father cleaned offices, he couldn't possibly own them. Robert pulled more documents from his briefcase, this time handing them only to the judge. Your Honor, this is a comprehensive list of Marcus Washington's real estate holdings. You'll note that property number 7 is 450 Morrison Street, a 14-story commercial building in downtown Boston. Current tenant, Ashford Consulting Group, annual lease payment of $2.3 million. The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Daniel sat down heavily, his face gone gray. Preston was flipping through pages frantically, his professional composure cracking. Margaret made a sound that might have been a gasp or might have been the beginning of a word that died before it could form. Daniel has been paying rent to my father for 5 years? Naomi kept her voice level, conversational, as if she were discussing the weather instead of the systematic dismantling of her husband's entire understanding of his own success. Every month, signing checks to Madison Property Trust, never questioning who actually owned the company he thought he was building? Your Honor, this doesn't... Preston tried, but Judge Harrison held up one hand. Let me finish reviewing these documents. The judge read in silence for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 5 minutes. When she looked up, her expression had shifted from neutral to something that might have been impressed if judges allowed themselves such obvious reactions. Mr. Harrison, these appear to be legitimate property deeds and corporate filings. The documentation is extensive and properly notarized. There's more, Your Honor. Robert pulled out another folder, this one thicker. Marcus Washington spent the last 2 years of his life documenting Daniel Ashford's business practices. Included in this file are records of offshore accounts, tax irregularities, and evidence of financial fraud that Mr. Washington discovered through completely legal means, primarily because he owned the building where Mr. Ashford conducted business and had access to cleaning the offices where confidential documents were occasionally left unsecured. Preston shot to his feet. Your Honor, that's... Documents obtained through cleaning services can't possibly be admissible. Documents left in trash cans in buildings one owns are actually fair game, legally speaking. Robert's smile was thin. Mr. Washington was very careful about the legality of his information gathering. Everything in this file was obtained through proper channels or through material that was technically abandoned. Judge Harrison accepted the folder, began reading, and her expression grew progressively more stern. When she finally looked up, her gaze fixed on Daniel with the weight of judgment that needed no gavel to underscore it. Mr. Ashford, according to these documents, you've been transferring marital assets to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands for approximately 18 months. You've also been underreporting income to minimize tax liability and reduce your apparent net worth for the purposes of this divorce settlement. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Preston with desperation that would have been satisfying if it wasn't so pathetic. The attorney had no answers, just the stunned expression of someone who'd walked into what they thought was a simple divorce and found themselves in the middle of a federal case. Your Honor, I'd like to request a recess. Preston's voice had lost its earlier confidence. My client needs time to review these allegations and prepare a proper response. I'm sure he does. The judge's voice could have frozen salt water. However, we're going to proceed. Ms. Patterson, does your client have a counter-proposal for the divorce settlement? Grace stood, and Naomi could see the satisfaction she was working hard to keep off her face. Yes, Your Honor. Given that Mrs. Washington's personal assets substantially exceed those of Mr. Ashford, and given the evidence of his attempts to defraud her during these proceedings, we propose the following. Mrs. Washington will retain all inherited assets from her father's estate. Mr. Ashford will retain any legitimately acquired assets in his own name, pending investigation of the offshore accounts. However, any assets that Mr. Ashford concealed or attempted to hide during these proceedings will be forfeited to Mrs. Washington as compensation for fraud. Additionally, Mrs. Washington requests that Mr. Ashford pay $200,000 in damages for emotional distress and all legal fees associated with these proceedings. In exchange, Mrs. Washington will not pursue criminal charges related to the tax fraud and will allow supervised visitation with their daughter once she's born, provided Mr. Ashford completes parenting classes and demonstrates stable housing. The terms landed like grenades, each one detonating a different piece of Daniel's carefully constructed life. 200,000 in damages, forfeiture of hidden assets. Criminal charges hanging over him like a sword that Naomi could drop any time she wanted. Supervised visitation. The particular humiliation of having to prove himself worthy of seeing his own child. Naomi. Daniel's voice cracked on her name. Please. We've been married 8 years. That has to mean something. She looked at him across the courtroom. This man she'd loved enough to give up her job for, trusted enough to combine bank accounts with, believed in enough to carry his child while he calculated how to minimize what he owed her. 8 years. But how many of those years had been real and how many had been performance? The gradual erosion of affection disguised as the natural evolution of marriage. 8 years means I know exactly who you are, Daniel. It means I watched you choose your mother's approval over my dignity. Watched you choose Victoria over our family. Watched you plan to leave me with nothing while our daughter was growing inside me. So yes, 8 years means something. It means I gave you 8 years to prove my father wrong about you. Her voice didn't shake. That was the part that surprised her most. How steady she sounded, how calm, when inside she was vibrating with 4 years of swallowed anger finally finding voice. You failed. Not spectacularly, not dramatically, just quietly choosing convenience over character until you'd become someone I didn't recognize anymore. Margaret stood in the gallery, her face flushed. You can't do this. You can't take everything he's worked for just because your father had money. I'm not taking anything, Margaret. Naomi turned to face her mother-in-law fully, let all the words she'd swallowed for 4 years rise to the surface. I'm keeping what was always mine. The house, my father bought it. Daniel's company, my father funded it. The cars, the country club membership, your social standing, all built on investments my father made, on buildings my father owned, on connections my father facilitated while you treated him like he was beneath your notice. You were never beneath my notice. Margaret's voice had gone shrill, desperate. You were exactly what I noticed, a woman from nowhere trying to social climb on my son's coattails. No. Robert's voice cut through the building tension. She was a woman testing whether your son could love someone for who they were instead of what they brought to his image. He couldn't, and now he'll spend the rest of his life understanding what that failure cost. Judge Harrison's gavel came down, sharp and final. Mr. Ashford, do you accept the settlement as proposed, or do we need to schedule a trial where these offshore accounts and tax irregularities get examined by federal investigators? Daniel looked at Preston, at his mother, at Naomi. His expression cycled through denial, anger, bargaining, and landed somewhere in the territory of broken understanding. I accept. The words came out quiet, defeated, and Naomi felt nothing except tired. No triumph, no satisfaction, just the hollow recognition that winning like this meant everyone had already lost something that couldn't be recovered. Very well. The judge made notes, signed something, handed papers to the clerk. This court grants the divorce between Daniel Ashford and Naomi Washington. Asset division will proceed according to the settlement as outlined. Mr. Ashford has 30 days to vacate the property at 847 Longwood Avenue, which is owned by the Washington Family Trust. Mrs. Washington will assume full ownership immediately. The gavel came down again, and it was over. 8 years of marriage dissolved in less time than it took to order coffee, reduced to legal language and financial settlements and the particular silence that comes when there's nothing left to say. The courthouse steps were slick with ice when Naomi emerged into December air that felt like breathing glass. Grace walked beside her, Robert slightly behind, forming a protective triangle that probably looked more coordinated than it was. Across the plaza, Daniel stood with Preston and Margaret, the three of them huddled in conversation that looked like damage control or maybe just damage. Naomi's phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't recognize. Summit Express delivery scheduled for 847 Longwood Avenue, 2 p.m. today. Driver, Ellis Brooks. Her father's letter had mentioned Ellis, the man who would help when everything fell apart. Apparently, everything had fallen apart right on schedule. "I need to go to the house." The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them. "Before Daniel clears it out, before anything gets moved or taken. I need to see it one more time as mine." Grace checked her watch. "Robert and I have to file the final paperwork, but that won't take long. I can meet you there in an hour. I'll be fine alone." It wasn't entirely true. 7 months pregnant in winter qualified as the opposite of fine. But Naomi needed space that didn't include lawyers or legal documents or the careful management of other people's expectations. She needed to stand in the house she'd lived in for 4 years and understand that it had always belonged to her father, that every argument with Daniel about mortgage payments had been theater, that her entire marriage had been built on foundations she hadn't known existed. The taxi dropped her in front of 847 Longwood Avenue at 1:30. The house looked exactly as it had when she'd left 6 days ago. 2-story colonial in a neighborhood that aspired to prestige without quite achieving it. Front walk neatly shoveled, Christmas wreath on the door that Naomi had hung herself because Daniel said holiday decorations were Margaret's domain and she'd get to them eventually. The key still worked. Small mercy. Naomi let herself in, stood in the foyer where she'd stood the first time Daniel brought her here, back when the house was empty and full of promise and he'd carried her over the threshold like people did in movies. The gesture had seemed romantic then. Now it felt like foreshadowing. Him carrying her into a space that wasn't his to claim, performing ownership of something borrowed. The furniture was still here, their belongings mixed together in ways that would require sorting. Daniel's expensive suits in the closet next to her thrift store dresses, his golf clubs in the garage beside her old bicycle, the nursery they'd started preparing 3 months ago, before the affair became impossible to ignore, still half-finished with paint samples taped to the wall and a crib they'd argued about because Daniel thought the one Naomi chose looked cheap. She stood in the nursery doorway, hand on her belly, and tried to imagine bringing her daughter home to this room. Couldn't make the image cohere. This house had been built on lies. Not dramatic ones, not the kind that exploded, just the steady accumulation of small untruths that added up to a marriage that had never been what either of them pretended. The doorbell rang at 2 exactly. Naomi navigated the stairs carefully, opened the door to find a man in his mid-40s wearing a Summit Express jacket and holding a clipboard. Black, medium height, with the kind of face that suggested he smiled often even when he wasn't smiling now. "Delivery for Mrs. Washington?" His voice carried the particular warmth of someone who meant the courtesy instead of just performing it. "I've got 3 boxes from Harrison and Associates. They're heavy. Legal files, I'm guessing. Want me to bring them in?" "Please." He made 2 trips to his truck, carried in boxes that looked official and probably contained more documentation of her father's empire, more evidence of the life Marcus Washington had lived while the world saw only the janitor. On the second trip, Ellis paused in the foyer, looked around at the house with an expression Naomi couldn't quite read. "Nice place. You live here?" I do. I'm not sure anymore." The honesty surprised her. She'd spent 4 years being careful about what she revealed to strangers, had learned from Margaret that vulnerability was weakness and weakness was something to be hidden. But Ellis had the kind of face that made honesty feel safe instead of dangerous. "Moving out or moving in?" He set the boxes down carefully, pulled out the clipboard for her signature. Neither. Both. It's complicated. Most worthwhile things are. He handed her the pen, waited while she signed. I don't mean to pry, but you look like you could use some help. These boxes need to go somewhere specific? Naomi gestured toward Daniel's study. Would have to stop thinking of it as his. Start thinking of it as just the study, just a room. Ellis carried them in, stacked them neatly beside the desk where Daniel had spent countless evenings doing work that her father had made possible. The irony was layered enough to be comedy if it wasn't so sad. Thank you, I appreciate it. Ellis nodded, started to leave, then paused. Look, I don't know your situation and it's none of my business, but I've been doing deliveries for 15 years and I've gotten pretty good at reading when someone's going through something hard, so I'm just going to say whatever it is, you're handling it better than you think you are. The kindness of it hit unexpected and sharp. Naomi had spent 6 days surrounded by lawyers and legal proceedings and the careful deployment of her father's resources like strategic weapons. No one had asked if she was okay. No one had offered comfort without calculation. Ellis's words weren't profound or revolutionary, but they were human in a way she'd forgotten people could be. I'm 7 months pregnant and my marriage just ended and I found out my dead father was a secret billionaire and I own everything my husband thought he'd built. The words tumbled out uncensored. So I'm either handling it terribly or I'm in shock and won't realize how badly I'm handling it until later. Ellis's expression shifted through surprise to something like understanding. That's a lot for 1 week. That's a lot for one life. He pulled a business card from his pocket, wrote something on the back. This is my personal number. This isn't a line or anything weird. I just think sometimes it helps to talk to someone who's not a lawyer or family or anyone with an agenda. If you need to move boxes or need someone to listen while you figure things out or just need another human being to confirm that, yeah, this is objectively insane, call. Naomi took the card, looked at the handwriting on the back. Neat, careful. The kind that suggested he'd been taught young that presentation mattered. Why would you do that? You don't know me. No, but I know what it's like to go through hard things alone. And I know that sometimes the person who helps isn't the one you expect. He moved toward the door, paused again. My mom used to say that God sends you angels when you need them. But sometimes the angels wear delivery uniforms and drive trucks instead of having wings. Maybe I'm your delivery truck angel today. He left before Naomi could respond, his footsteps crunching on the icy walk. Truck engines starting and fading into the ambient noise of the neighborhood. She stood holding his card, feeling like she'd just been handed something more valuable than any of the legal documents Robert kept providing. The boxes from Harrison and Associates turned out to contain property deeds for all 12 commercial buildings her father had owned. Corporate documentation for the 6 companies he'd invested in, and a leather-bound ledger that tracked 40 years of investments, with the precision of someone who understood that wealth was built in details. Naomi spread the papers across Daniel's desk, her desk now, and tried to comprehend the scope of what she'd inherited. Property values alone totaled $800 million. The companies her father had stakes in were worth another $3 billion. Liquid assets in various investment accounts added up to numbers that stopped meaning anything after the first few zeros. And underneath all of it, the patient architecture of a man who'd built an empire while being invisible to the people who thought visibility was the only kind of power that counted. One document stood out, a handwritten letter tucked into the back of the ledger, dated 1 week before her father's death. Naomi, if you're reading this, you've won. Not because you got the money, though that helps. You've won because you waited long enough to see who people really are. That's the hardest kind of winning. The kind that requires patience most people can't afford. I'm enclosing one more thing. A list of people who helped me build this. Not lawyers or accountants. Those are professionals doing their jobs. I mean the people who saw me as Marcus instead of the janitor. The diner waitress who always gave me extra coffee. the security guard who let me work late without hassle, the junior accountant at Pierce Financial who answered my questions about municipal bonds even though I came to meetings in my work uniform. These people treated me like I mattered before they knew I had money. That's rare. When you're distributing any of this wealth, and I hope you do distribute some because hoarding it would miss the point entirely, remember the people who were kind when kindness cost them something. Also, I've set aside $5 million for Ellis Brooks. You haven't met him yet, but you will. He's going to help you move on from Daniel, though he won't know that's what he's doing. Give him the money as a thank you for being the kind of person who sees people instead of circumstances. Tell him it's from the delivery truck angel's anonymous benefactor. He'll understand even if it makes no sense. I'm tired now. The doctor says I should rest, but resting feels like giving up. I'll probably ignore him and work through the night on this last batch of documents. If this is the last thing I write to you, know that you were the point of everything. The buildings, the investments, the careful architecture of all this wealth. It was only ever about making sure you'd be okay. You're going to be better than okay, sweetheart. You're going to be extraordinary. Love always, Dad. Naomi read the letter 3 times, each pass finding new weight in words she'd thought she understood. $5 million for Ellis Brooks. Her father had known she'd meet him, had planned for the intersection of their lives with the same precision he'd applied to every other element of his strategy. The man had been dead for 2 years and he was still orchestrating moments that felt like providence. Her phone rang, Grace's name on the screen. Paperwork's filed. Everything's official as of 3 p.m. How are you holding up? I'm sitting in a house I just found out I've always owned, reading letters from my dead father about how to spend $12 billion, and apparently I'm supposed to give $5 million to a delivery driver I met an hour ago because my father predicted we'd meet and decided he deserved it. Grace's pause suggested she was trying to determine if Naomi was joking. That's very specific. My father was very thorough. Do you want company? I can come sit with you, help you process. What Naomi wanted was to be alone with the enormity of what had happened, to sit in the house that had never belonged to Daniel and figure out what came next. But alone felt dangerous. Too much space for the last 4 years to replay, too much room for second-guessing decisions that couldn't be undone. Actually, yes, but bring coffee. Real coffee. Not the decaf nonsense my doctor keeps insisting on. Grace arrived 20 minutes later with a thermos of something that smelled like it violated several prenatal guidelines and a bag of pastries from the Italian bakery near her office. They sat in the kitchen, Naomi's kitchen, though it would take time for that possessive pronoun to feel earned, and worked through the logistics of what happened next. Daniel has 30 days to remove his belongings. Margaret called my office 4 times already demanding we extend the deadline, but the judge was clear, 30 days starting today. Where will they go? Honestly, I don't care. Grace's voice carried an edge Naomi hadn't heard before. Margaret spent 4 years making you feel small. Daniel spent 6 months planning how to minimize what you'd get in the divorce. They can figure out their own housing situation. It should have felt satisfying. The justice of Daniel and Margaret scrambling for apartments, facing the consequences of assumptions that had proven catastrophically wrong. But satisfaction felt far away, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. Winning like this meant everyone had already lost the things that actually mattered. What about Victoria? Grace's smile turned sharp. Broke up with Daniel 2 days ago. Apparently she's engaged to one of his former clients now, some venture capitalist who didn't lose everything in a divorce. Women like Victoria have excellent survival instincts. The next week passed in a blur of legal proceedings and property transfers, and the strange process of learning to live in a house that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. Daniel came to collect his clothes, his golf clubs, his collection of expensive watches that Naomi now knew had been gifts from her father laundered through fake bonuses. He moved through the rooms like a ghost, not speaking, not making eye contact, just gathering belongings and loading them into a U-Haul truck parked in the driveway. Margaret didn't come. Sent movers instead, professional men who wrapped her son's life in bubble wrap and cardboard boxes with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. Naomi watched from the kitchen window, hand on her belly, feeling her daughter kick and roll in rhythms that suggested she was running out of space. On the 8th day, Grace called with news that the federal investigation into Daniel's offshore accounts had concluded. They're not pressing charges. He cooperated fully, paid the back taxes, and agreed to permanent disbarment from his CPA certification. He'll never work in finance again, but he won't go to prison. Is that mercy or just pragmatism? Does it matter? The outcome's the same. It probably didn't matter. Daniel would spend the rest of his life understanding what he'd lost, not in dramatic revelation, but in quiet moments. The monthly rent checks and job applications and the particular humiliation of explaining to new people why his career had imploded. That was consequence enough. Naomi had no interest in vengeance that required his complete destruction. Christmas arrived quiet and strange. Naomi spent it alone in the house, reading through more of her father's papers and trying to imagine what he'd been thinking during those 40 years of building in silence. She'd set up a small tree in the living room. Nothing like the elaborate decoration Margaret used to orchestrate, just something to mark the day as different from other days. Her phone rang at 2 p.m., Ellis's number on the screen. She'd been expecting him to call, had been waiting since the delivery a week ago for him to take her up on the offer of conversation with someone who had no agenda. "Merry Christmas, I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Just me and a stack of legal documents. You're actually a welcome interruption. I was thinking about what you said about your father and the secret billions and all of it. And I wanted to ask, not because I'm nosy, but because I've been there. Are you doing okay? Like actually okay, not just functioning okay?" The question deserved a real answer. "I don't know yet. Ask me in a few months when the shock wears off." "Fair enough. Listen, I know this is going to sound strange, but I'm really good at moving boxes and terrible at spending holidays alone. If you need help organizing all those legal documents or just want another human in the house for a few hours, I'm available. No expectations, no agenda, just company." Naomi looked around the living room, at the boxes she hadn't unpacked and the papers she hadn't organized and the emptiness that came from spending Christmas in a house that was legally hers but didn't feel like home. Actually, that sounds perfect. Ellis arrived an hour later with Chinese takeout, the good kind from the place in Chinatown that didn't deliver this far, which meant he'd driven across the city specifically to bring it. They ate on the floor of the living room because the dining table still felt like it belonged to Daniel somehow, and talked about things that had nothing to do with money or divorce or the complicated legacy of dead fathers. He told her about growing up in Roxbury, about his mother who'd cleaned houses and his father who'd driven a city bus, about working his way through community college and deciding that delivery driving gave him freedom that office jobs couldn't match. She told him about losing her mother young, about her father's quiet strength, about meeting Daniel in a coffee shop and believing for a while that love was enough to bridge different worlds. "It's not, though." Ellis opened his fortune cookie, read the paper inside, and laughed. "Your patience will be rewarded. Little late for that advice. My father used to say that patience is the most expensive thing to own, that most people can't afford it. Your father sounds like he was smart about more than just money." They worked through the evening organizing documents into categories that made sense. Property deeds in one box, corporate papers in another, personal letters from her father in a third that Naomi would read slowly over the coming months. Ellis moved boxes without complaint, made coffee when the initial pot ran out, and asked questions that suggested he was actually listening instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. At 9 p.m., with the living room transformed from chaos to order, he stood to leave. "Thank you for letting me help. I know it's weird accepting assistance from essentially a stranger, but sometimes that's easier than accepting it from people who think they know what you need. Naomi walked him to the door, paused with her hand on the knob. My father left instructions in his will. He set aside $5 million for you. Ellis's expression froze, the smile fading into something that might have been shock or might have been the beginning of laughter. I'm sorry, what? 5 million. He wrote that you were going to help me move on from my marriage, that you'd be kind when kindness cost you something, and that you deserved to be compensated for being the kind of person who sees people instead of circumstances. Your father and I never met. How could he? I don't know. Naomi pulled out the letter, showed him the paragraph about delivery truck angels and anonymous benefactors. But he knew. Somehow he knew you'd be here, that you'd help, that you'd matter, and he wanted to make sure you were taken care of. Ellis read the letter twice, his hands shaking slightly. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. I don't need $5 million. I came here because it seemed like the right thing to do, not because I expected payment. I know. That's why you're getting it. Because you helped when helping had no benefit to you. That's exactly the kind of person my father wanted me to remember. He left with a check for $5 million and an expression that suggested he was still processing reality. Naomi watched his truck pull away, then returned to the living room and the boxes they'd organized. Her father had been right about Ellis, about his kindness, about his importance, about the way some people helped because that's who they were instead of because they expected return on investment. The lesson was clear. Pay attention to people who were kind when kindness cost them something. They were rarer than wealth and more valuable than any portfolio her father had built. January arrived with snow and new routines. Naomi hired a property manager to handle the commercial buildings, found an investment advisor who specialized in generational wealth, and started the slow process of figuring out what to do with $12 billion she'd never asked for. Robert suggested a foundation, something focused on education or housing or the causes Marcus had cared about quietly for 40 years. Your father believed in lifting others up. He didn't publicize it, didn't want his name on buildings or plaques. But he funded scholarships, paid medical bills for families who couldn't afford them, bought apartment buildings and kept rents low even when the market said he could charge more. He used wealth the way tools are meant to be used, to build things and fix things and make the world slightly less brutal for people who were trying. Naomi started small, paid off medical debt for everyone in her father's old apartment building, funded full scholarships for 5 students at the community college Ellis had attended, bought the coffee shop where she'd met Daniel and converted it into a nonprofit job training program for people re-entering the workforce after incarceration. Each gift felt like honoring her father's memory while also writing her own story. Not the story of Marcus Washington's daughter spending his money, but the story of Naomi Washington understanding what wealth was actually for. Ellis called weekly, their friendship settling into something comfortable and uncomplicated. He'd used the $5 million to start a nonprofit delivery service that hired people with criminal records, people who couldn't get traditional jobs because background checks closed doors before interviews could open them. 50 employees in the first month, all of them learning logistics and customer service and the particular dignity of earning a paycheck. Your father gave me more than money. Ellis's voice carried wonder even 3 weeks later. He gave me the ability to do what I've wanted to do for a decade. Every person I hire is someone who gets a second chance. That's not wealth. That's transformation. February brought warmer days and the particular exhaustion of being 8 months pregnant. Naomi's doctor scheduled weekly appointments, monitoring her closely because first pregnancies at 28 weren't risky exactly but required attention. The baby Hope, Naomi had decided to name her, Hope Marcus Washington, was active and healthy and apparently eager to make her entrance ahead of schedule. Daniel requested supervised visitation rights, submitted to the parenting classes the court had mandated, and found an apartment in Quincy that cost more than he could afford on his new salary as a junior accountant at a firm that didn't know his history. Margaret lived with him, the two of them sharing space in ways that probably felt like punishment for both. Grace reported that Margaret had tried to return to her charity boards, her garden clubs, her social circles that had defined her worth for decades. The reception had been cold, not hostile exactly, just absent. Invitations that didn't arrive, committees that suddenly had no openings, the particular social death of being tolerated instead of welcomed. She showed up at church last week. Grace had started sharing these updates with amusement instead of satisfaction. Sat in the back pew alone. People were polite but distant. One woman I know said it best, "You can't spit on a pregnant woman in front of 60 witnesses and expect people to forget." Naomi tried to feel satisfaction at Margaret's fall from social grace, but mostly felt tired. The cruelty of consequence was that it worked both ways. Margaret suffered, yes, but suffering didn't teach her anything except to be bitter. There was no redemption arc, no moment of recognition where the older woman understood what she'd done wrong. Just the slow erosion of a life built on status and the terrible realization that status was the one thing money couldn't buy back once you'd lost it. On Valentine's Day, Ellis showed up with flowers, not roses, which would have been romantic and therefore complicated, but tulips in yellows and whites that suggested friendship and nothing more. They had dinner at the house, Chinese takeout again, because it had become their tradition, and talked about the foundation Naomi was planning. "I want to call it the Marcus Washington Foundation for Second Chances. Education, housing, job training, all the things my father believed in but never publicized. All the ways wealth can be used to give people the space to become who they're capable of being." Ellis nodded, thoughtful. "Your father would be proud, not because of the money you're giving away, but because you understand what he understood, that the point of having resources isn't to hoard them. It's to use them to make ladders for other people to climb." The baby kicked, sharp and insistent, and Naomi winced. 8 months pregnant meant every movement felt magnified, every shift in position a negotiation with physics. Ellis noticed, brought her water, helped her find a comfortable position on the couch, even though comfortable was relative at this stage. "When's your due date?" "March 15th. 2 weeks away, though the doctor says first babies are usually late." "You have help lined up? Someone to drive you to the hospital, stay with you during labor?" Naomi hadn't thought about it. Not really, not beyond the abstract awareness that eventually the baby would come and she'd need to deal with that reality. Grace had offered, but Grace was her lawyer, not her friend, and there was something too transactional about having her attorney present for childbirth. "I'll figure it out." Ellis's expression suggested he was about to volunteer, then thought better of it, then decided to say it anyway. "I could be there. Not in the delivery room, that's too intimate and we barely know each other. But I could drive you to the hospital, wait in the waiting room, be the person who calls whoever needs to be called. Just so you're not alone." The offer sat between them, generous and slightly awkward, and exactly what Naomi needed without having known she needed it. "Why do you keep helping me?" "Honestly? Because your father gave me $5 million to be kind to you, and I feel like I should earn it." He smiled to show he was joking. "But also because you're interesting and you're going through something hard, and I know what it's like to go through hard things alone, so if I can make it less alone, why wouldn't I?" Hope Marcus Washington arrived 3 days early, on March 12th at 4 in the morning. Naomi woke to contractions that felt like someone was squeezing her entire torso in a vice, called Ellis because he'd made her promise to call, and found herself in his truck driving to Massachusetts General through Boston streets, still dark with winter night. Labor lasted 14 hours. Not terrible for a first baby, the nurses said, though Naomi would have argued that any amount of time, feeling like your body was trying to turn itself inside out, qualified as terrible. Ellis waited in the waiting room, texting updates to Grace and Robert, and apparently also ordering food for the nursing staff because that's the kind of thing he did without being asked. When Hope finally arrived, small and furious and perfect, Naomi held her daughter and understood for the first time what her father had been protecting. Not just Naomi herself, but the next generation. The chance to raise a child who understood her worth from the beginning instead of having to discover it through trial and painful error. Ellis came to visit after visiting ours, brought flowers again and a hand-carved wooden rattle he said his uncle had made. He looked at Hope with the particular awe people reserve for newborns, the recognition that something impossible had just become possible. "She's beautiful. Looks like you." "She looks like a tiny, angry old man, but thank you." They laughed, quiet in the hospital room, and Naomi felt something shift. Not romantic, not yet, maybe never, but the recognition that Ellis Brooks had become important in ways that had nothing to do with her father's instructions or the $5 million. He'd become the kind of friend who showed up, who helped without agenda, who saw her as Naomi instead of as Marcus Washington's daughter or Daniel Ashford's ex-wife or the woman with $12 billion. 3 days later, Naomi brought Hope home to the house on Longwood Avenue. The nursery was finished now. Ellis had helped paint it during her 3rd trimester, had assembled the crib she'd chosen despite Daniel's objections, had made the room ready for the daughter who would grow up knowing her grandfather only through stories and the foundation that bore his name. Grace visited with gifts and legal documents, trust funds to establish, guardianship papers to file, the bureaucratic requirements of raising a child who was technically worth billions before she could walk. Robert came with more of Marcus's letters, these ones written to Hope for milestones years in the future. First day of school, first heartbreak, 18th birthday, college graduation. Your grandfather wanted to make sure you always knew him. Robert's voice carried the weight of executing a friend's last wishes for years after death. He wrote you letters for every important moment, instructions to give them to you when the time comes. Naomi held Hope, looked at the stack of envelopes dated for years she couldn't imagine yet, and felt her father's presence in the careful architecture of his love. He'd known he wouldn't be there to watch his granddaughter grow, so he'd found a way to be there anyway, through letters and trust funds and the foundation that would carry his values forward long after anyone who'd known him was gone. Daniel requested his first supervised visit when Hope was 2 weeks old. Naomi agreed because the court mandated it and because Hope deserved the chance to know her father even if her father had proven himself unworthy of knowing her mother. The visits happened weekly, Daniel arriving at the house with a social worker and spending 2 hours holding his daughter with the careful uncertainty of someone who'd never expected to be here. He didn't apologize, never said the words that might have meant something if he'd said them earlier. Before the divorce, before the offshore accounts. Before he'd chosen Victoria and his mother's approval over the family he was building. The silence between them was complete, filled only with Hope's small sounds and the social worker's periodic notes. Margaret never came to visit. Grace reported that she'd moved out of Daniel's apartment, found a small condo in a neighborhood where no one knew her history, and spent her days volunteering at a church that needed help more than it needed social credentials. The fall wasn't redemptive, just practical. A woman learning to live with less because less was all that remained. Spring arrived slowly, March giving way to April and Boston shaking off winter like someone waking from difficult dreams. Naomi established the foundation officially, hired staff who understood that wealth was responsibility, and began the work of distributing her father's fortune in ways he would have approved. Ellis's nonprofit delivery service expanded to 3 cities. He called weekly with updates and occasional requests for advice, and their friendship deepened into something that felt permanent without requiring definition. Not romance. Naomi wasn't ready for that and might not be for years, but genuine connection. The kind built on showing up and being honest and helping each other become better versions of themselves. On a Saturday in late April, Naomi took Hope to the cemetery where her father was buried. The headstone was simple: Marcus Washington, beloved father, 1962 to 2022. No mention of the billions, the properties, the empire built in silence. Just a name and dates and the word beloved, which was probably the only epitaph he would have wanted. She sat on the grass, difficult with a 2-month-old but manageable, and talked to her father the way she'd done when he was alive, telling him about Hope's first smile and the Foundation's first scholarship recipients, and the way Ellis had become family without either of them planning it. The one-sided conversation felt less lonely than it should have, as if Marcus was listening from wherever the dead listen from, proud of the daughter who'd learned what he'd tried to teach. "You were right about everything." Naomi adjusted Hope in her arms, let her daughter's tiny hand grip her finger with surprising strength. "About Daniel, about patience, about the people who help when helping costs them something. You were right that real strength doesn't announce itself, that wealth is responsibility, that the point of building an empire is knowing when to share it." A cardinal landed on the headstone, bright red against gray stone, and Naomi chose to believe it meant something. Her father sending confirmation, or the universe offering comfort, or just a bird being a bird in spring. The meaning mattered less than the moment, sitting with her daughter at her father's grave, understanding finally that the inheritance hadn't been about money at all. It had been about teaching her to wait, to watch, to recognize her own worth when everyone else was trying to convince her she was small. The 12 billion was just a tool, a means to an end, the physical manifestation of lessons that mattered more than any bank account. Hope started fussing, hungry or uncomfortable or just ready to be somewhere else. Naomi stood carefully, kissed her fingertips and pressed them to her father's name on the headstone, and walked back to her car where Ellis was waiting, having driven them here because he'd understood without being told that some visits required company. "How'd it go?" He held the door while she secured Hope in the car seat, the practiced motion of someone who'd helped with this enough times to be competent. "Good. I think he would have liked you." "I hope so. I'm spending his money to hire people everyone else gave up on. That feels like something he'd approve of." They drove back to Longwood Avenue, to the house that had always been Naomi's without her knowing it, to the life she was building from pieces her father had prepared and pieces she was learning to add herself. The foundation, the friendships, the careful understanding that wealth was what you did with it instead of what you had. All of it felt like honoring Marcus while also becoming fully Naomi. That evening, after Ellis left and Hope was sleeping and the house was quiet with the particular silence of spaces held in trust, Naomi opened the first letter her father had written to his granddaughter. The envelope was marked for Hope, first month of life. "Dear Hope, by the time you read this, you'll be old enough to understand that your grandfather was someone you never met but who loved you before you were born. I'm writing this when your mother is 5 years away from meeting your father, years before you'll exist as anything except possibility. But I already know you're coming, and I already know you're going to be extraordinary. Your name is Hope because that's what you represent, the chance to do things right, to learn from mistakes, to build something better than what came before. Your mother is the strongest person I know, though it took her time to see it in herself. She'll teach you to be strong too, but a different kind of strong than the world usually celebrates. The kind of strength that waits, the kind that watches, the kind that knows its own worth even when everyone else is trying to convince you you're worthless. That's the inheritance I'm leaving you. Not the money, though there's plenty of that. The real inheritance is understanding that patience is power, that silence can be strength, that building in the dark doesn't make your work any less real. Your mother waited for justice instead of settling for anger. She stayed kind when people were cruel. She chose consequence over revenge. Those are the lessons I want you to learn, not from me, because I won't be there to teach them, but from watching how she lives. Be good to her, Hope. She's been through more than anyone should have to endure, and she did it with more grace than I could have managed. Be the daughter she deserves. Be the woman she's teaching you to be. Be hope in the way your name promises, and remember, you were never the point of the money. The money was the point of you. The tool I built so your mother could protect you, so you could grow up safe and strong and certain of your worth. I wish I could meet you, but since I can't, I'll settle for knowing that you exist, that you carry our family forward, that you'll understand what your grandmother and I tried to teach your mother. That real wealth is measured in love, in patience, in the people who help when helping costs them something. Welcome to the world, granddaughter. Make it better than we left it. Love always, Grandpa Marcus. Naomi folded the letter carefully, placed it back in its envelope, and added it to the box where she was keeping all the pieces of her father that remained. Letters and photographs and the leather journal that tracked 40 years of patient empire building. Hope would read these someday, would understand who her grandfather had been and why that mattered. But for now, Naomi held her sleeping daughter and looked around the house that had been hers all along, at the life that was finally becoming what it should have been, at the future that felt open instead of predetermined. The inheritance her father had left wasn't billions or properties or corporate partnerships. It was the knowledge that she'd always been enough, that the woman Daniel had dismissed and Margaret had underestimated and the world had tried to convince was small had actually been exactly the right size all along. Just patient enough to wait for everyone else to notice.